Welcome both. Again, welcome back. Although it's your home, Georgina. We're in the Institute for Government, but thank you for having us here, and nice to see you, Sam. And we've now got both the documents. Do they look miles apart?
Well, this one's blue.
Do they look an ocean apart? Do they look yards apart? What do you think are the chances of those two documents being merged into an agreement somehow?
So I think there are obviously some very clear issues where the UK and the EU are just on completely different pages. And we know what they are, we've discussed them in the past on this podcast even, but so issues to do with level playing field, what obligations there are when it comes to environment and labour protections, what rules there are governing the UK state aid regime. There's also issues around the role of the European Court of Justice, and then also whether there should be multiple agreements or it should all be packaged as one big agreement. But the thing that I think people should be aware of is that once you get past all of those massive issues, which is obviously quite difficult to do, when it comes to the nature of the future UK-EU trading relationship, the EU and the UK are largely on the same page. You can point to a few specific issues where they differ slightly, but they know what they want and what it could look like. It's just a case of how do we get there?
Yeah, particularly because I think on the EU side, it's the same process, i.e. it's the Commission negotiating on behalf of the Member States. But actually, depending on the kind of agreement, it might need to be signed off by national and regional parliaments, let alone the 27 EU governments and the European Parliament, which is a new beast, much more fractured. And so there are many more EU voices there and many more EU people to please. And that could be a challenge as well, because it's not just about negotiating, reaching an agreement, it's about passing that agreement as well.
What do you think are the biggest problems here? Is there a chance that we do, as is threatened in the front pages of all of this, walk away in June? Is it just slow progress by June that could bring us down?
I mean, that June deadline it's not coming out of nowhere. In the political declaration, they did say that there would be a high-level conference at that point to take stock of the negotiations. Of course, I think when that deadline was mentioned, that was at the time when everyone thought that the UK would be leaving the EU on the 29th of March 2019. I think anyone can walk away from this negotiation. The EU could walk away as well. Is that a threat? Yes, but of course we could find ourselves in a situation where if that looks really likely, all of a sudden businesses start to react, start to panic, citizens as well. So it will really be a question and calculating what are the risks and what would that impact be. But at the moment, yes, I think it does make sense to say you would walk away. It's part of the leverage and the negotiation process.
You're less impressed, aren't you?
Well, it's just part of the theatre. And in a way, I'm less impressed because I feel that we've just been through all of this process before, where we go through all of the sort of theatrics, all of the drama, all of the chest beating, and then we know that when the deadline actually approaches, people go, oh, actually, let's see if we can work something out. And that's what I feel will happen this time. And in a way, that's what the EU's counting on. And of course, that's a calculated risk. The UK and Prime Minister Johnson could actually decide this time around he means it when he says he'll walk away and he's happy not having a deal. But my feeling is that, yes, we're going to have a few months of very loud noise, both the EU and the UK shouting past each other, but we won't really know what the compromise is or could be until later on in the year when the looming cliff edge of leaving without a trade agreement is much closer.
Yeah, and both sides have known for a while, I think, that the UK's intention is not to extend that period of talks beyond the end of the year. That's already a very short time frame. I think from the EU's perspective, they're thinking, does the UK really want to shorten that time frame even more?
If you walked away in June and wasted the summer and then tried to come back, that's time burnt.
But we could absolutely do that. If you think about even last year, think about all the time we wasted during the Article 50 period, where we stormed off to have a general election, or we decided to have a leadership election in one of the two parties or in both. You can waste a lot of time and you can walk away, but it doesn't mean, even if we do walk away in June, it doesn't necessarily say to me that there's never going to be an agreement, because we could very well return to the table in September.
When you look at the gap between the two sides on the idea of the level playing field, can you imagine if the EU didn't absolutely insist on certain EU badging of institutions who arbitrate or the EU laws? If we just said we stay where we are and we don't regress, is that where the bones of an agreement lies?
I mean, I think sort of very quickly on this, the EU mandate talks about corresponding high standards. So that's not the same standards, although I think in certain areas like state aid, they will be much more robust. And I think some member states are very, very worried about the UK over time undercutting the EU and that level playing field no longer being level, and that creating all sorts of problems. The question is...
Can I just ask you just on that, are they more worried about a Conservative government pumping money into the economy or a Labour government, just a matter of interest?
Well, I wonder if it's not sort of, because over time has made that term over time has come into this new mandate frequently. I mean, it's there 3 or 4 times. I think they are very much thinking about divergence over time.
Decades.
And if you decades, and absolutely, because one government to the next could change where they want to invest money, what industries they want to prioritise, and where they see prosperity. And of course, that then does impact whatever trading relations it would have with the EU. That's how the EU see it.
But you were saying,
I think yes, it's not just this government, but very much any other future government.
But I think that you can see a way through on this, and it will require the UK backing down on certain things, and also the EU backing down on certain things. But if we look at environment and labour, the UK is saying, well, we're happy to commit to uphold international obligations that we already have, so say our obligation under the Paris Agreement or multiple other multilateral environment agreements. And we're also happy to make a vague commitment not to roll back on existing levels of protection so as to get a competitive advantage over you. But we don't want this to be enforceable. We don't want it to be based on EU rules and the like. And the EU saying, well, we want it to have EU rules as a point of reference, and we want to avoid divergence over time, and we want to be able to punish you if you do diverge. But can we find a compromise here? I think so, because the UK is going to have to sign up to enforcement and the possibility of concessions being withdrawn, so-called punishment, if it does a trade agreement with the US, because the US makes the same requests here. So if there is just a chance that we can rebrand this slightly. So obviously the UK needs to be able to say they got something, but say, look, we're in a situation where on day one we've got the same rules, and if we diverge over time to the point where there is an issue in which the UK or the EU is outcompeting the other on the because they've deregulated.
There's a sliding scale of punishment.
Then the other party can put in place tariffs. And what it comes down to is a choice between accepting tariffs now and saying, well, we don't want a free trade agreement, or saying, well, no, we'll agree this free trade agreement, but we accept that if there is a problem on this front in the future, then tariffs might come back into play.
It's hard to imagine, isn't it, Georgina, that there isn't actually a template for that already in the back room of
It's
Brussels.
already in the withdrawal. It's already in their mandate. So this is already in this proposal in terms of enforcement is already in the EU negotiating mandate. I think lots of people in the UK, when they hear the Commission saying, well, we want you to commit not to roll back from existing levels of protection, they then go in their mind, okay, but then they'll try and punish us. What will they do? The Commission will be here telling people what to do. No, the punishment if the UK does diverge to the point of market distortion is the EU might put in place some tariffs. That's it. There might be financial penalties attached that hasn't been negotiated, but that's it. We're not talking about anything more than that. The big problem, I think, though, where the EU is going to have to budge is on state aid, where what they're asking is much more intrusive. They're saying the UK should apply EU state aid rules in the UK into the future indefinitely.
Even if they change?
Even if they change. They should be enforced by UK-based bodies, but that body should work with the Commission to make sure it's compatible with what the EU is doing. And then if there's a dispute on issues of EU law, which state aid would be, that dispute panel would refer to the European Court of Justice's opinion and take that into account when arbitrating over the dispute. But again, what we're actually coming down to is if the UK diverges a lot, the EU might put in place tariffs. And I just think
But the initial block, you can't imagine Georgina accepting those sorts of mechanisms, can you, Britain?
I mean, at the moment, that doesn't seem very likely. But I do think, and it's worth re-emphasising this, the UK has left the European Union. The EU has been under no illusion that that meant that the UK wanted to do things differently. The problem with the EU is they don't know what the UK wants to do differently, and they're trying to plan accordingly to that. And they don't really want to be in a situation where you're having punitive action and you're reacting to divergence. They're trying to be in a position where you prevent divergence. And the reason for that is because divergence disrupts trade flows, and any disruption to trade flows means potentially more cost for producers and more cost for consumers. It means disruption of supply chains, and all of that's very costly. So they're thinking about it in sort of a much more long-term way. But the problem is what they're proposing at the moment is never going to fly here. But I suspect that, in Brussels, behind closed doors, they are exploring different options.
And, I feel, I'll probably write a piece about this, but I feel I could design something that, if I could convince the Prime Minister to accept it, he could sell. Right, there's a huge amount of ifs in that I'm never going to be in a position to do that. But
are you applying to be a weirdo in Dominic Cummings' new empire?
Well, I did read Super Forecasting or listen to it on Audible book last week, so maybe. No, I'm absolutely not. I have no interest whatsoever.
We're going to hold you to account, yeah. Look forward to reading it, Sam.
Yes.
The British government is saying that it's the EU who have overinterpreted the political declaration, that extra document signed up to alongside the withdrawal agreement, and that they've added lots of paragraphs and extra definitions, which means that they're stretching the definition of level playing field, and what we actually signed up to matches what we have put in this new negotiating document. Who's right there?
So I really don't have time for this argument, because just because throughout this entire process, the EU has said, we are happy to negotiate a free trade agreement with you that looks like the one we have with Canada. However, because you're big and nearby, we will ask more of you in these areas. That's been a constant throughout. So to say this is a surprise or they've moved the goalposts, that's just can't be true. We've always known this is what the EU means by it. It's absolutely fine that the UK disagrees with their exact interpretation of that and how they want to implement it on the ground, but it's not new.
And the political declaration, who's moved furthest from that? There seems to be a fair bit of cross-channel insults flying.
The political declaration was always going to be ambitious. It was going to set this idea of what an ideal future UK-EU relationship would look like. It was never legally binding, and I think the EU and the UK actually throughout the negotiations were saying that negotiation still has to happen. Right. This is our ambition, but this is not where, this is not necessarily where we will end up. Again, I think, as Sam said earlier, that a lot of what's in these two mandates actually was in the political declaration, so it's not completely new. Of course, it won't be exactly the political declaration, in the same way that the final agreement won't be exactly what these mandates have outlined. The question is what does that landing zone look like, and do we have enough time to reach it?
Both parties are setting out their stall. The EU's taken a hyper-maximalist approach on certain areas of the political declaration, and the UK's chosen to interpret it slightly differently because it believes it's in its interest to interpret it that way. And that's fine. This is the beginning of the negotiation. This is what the UK wants. This is what the EU wants. And guess what? They don't agree on everything.
These are pretty much the sorts of levels of the documents you'd normally expect at the beginning of a major trade negotiation like this. You've seen a few of them, both of you.
Yeah.
It used to be, the negotiated mandates of the EU used to be secret.
Yeah.
So it used to be that you only saw them if they leaked, but now after they've learned some lessons of their failed negotiation with the US, they have started publishing them all. So we've seen them in the past, but usually we had to get hold of them through nefarious means. So it's actually quite nice that it's being published.
I mean, traditionally what happens is they will, both sides will draft sort of a mandate, they'll exchange it, they'll have time to look at it. Not clear that happened, whether both sides just saw it once it had been published online. But of course, I think both sides acknowledge that this is what their starting point. You'd expect them to be miles apart, you'd expect them to be having, holding very tough lines. But it's where will they end up? And I suspect that on both sides there are lots of discussions right now about their red lines, where they can't move, how far they're willing to move, and what they would be ready to walk away from.
And I would push back slightly, because I do want to emphasise this. Miles apart on certain specific issues. Because again, as I said at the beginning of our discussion, if you actually go through this page by page, and you probably counted the number of pages where the UK and EU were roughly in the same place, it would easily outnumber the areas where there's disagreement. So a lot of what we're looking at here gives me hope. Then of course, it gives me hope that there'll be a trade agreement. But then of course, the issues where there are disagreement aren't small ones.
On the structure of the talks, if you go all the way back to the original Brexit divorce agreement, Britain wanted a certain type of structure, the European Union wanted another structure. It's fair to say, isn't it, that we ended up 100% on the European Union template. This time again, we've got a difference in how these should be structured. Britain would like lots of separate agreements, and they would like an overarching agreement in which they're all interrelated. We worry that that means they'll try and pressurise us on one to affect another. Who's going to win that, or is it already game over?
Who's going to win? Yes.
Well, yeah, it really depends. I think, if we didn't have this sort of cut-off date by the end of the year, and we had, years and years of negotiations, I think the EU would be pushing very, very hard about having one comprehensive agreement, because they don't really like little agreements on the side.
So just to clarify, so that incorporates trade as one pillar, then security as another, then say transport as something else,
and all sort of packaged in one deal. But of
nothing's
course,
agreed till everything's agreed.
Kind of, but I think there's a recognition that if the cut-off date is the end of the year, and in fact, von der Leyen, who's the Commission president, when she was in London earlier this year, said we're not going to be able to do everything. We're going to have to prioritise, and the question is what does that basic deal look like? And if it is a basic deal, i.e. it doesn't cover everything, does that necessarily mean that those things that haven't been covered will be separate agreements, or is it something that we're piling on top but at a later stage?
So my feeling on this is that ultimately this, however it's negotiated, even if it's negotiated as separate packages, so we negotiate trade over here, justice and home affairs here, security and defence here, and they're separate, the EU will ultimately try and package it underneath one horizontal agreement where the governance structure sits. So that's where you embed political dialogues, you also have dispute, you also have mechanisms to allow for continued negotiation. And the reason I say this is what they're trying to avoid is the exact issue they have with Switzerland, which is whereby they have lots of different agreements with different enforcement mechanisms, then it gets very unwieldy and it creates lots of problems. And right now they're trying to negotiate with Switzerland an institutional framework agreement that sits over all of this. So it doesn't seem to me to be likely that the EU is going to immediately try and recreate that system they hate with the UK. But the UK, as you said in your question, is obviously quite cautious of having this overarching structure, because they worry that, say we misbehave on trade over here, the EU might threaten us on, say, access to databases to do with justice and home affairs over here. They're worried about the interlinkages, which is exactly what the EU does want to do. So it's not an unfounded fear. And
actually already does with Switzerland. I mean, if you look back a couple of years ago, Switzerland held a referendum on trying to limit the number of EU workers, I think particularly because Croatia was looking to join Schengen at the time. And that sort of erupted, it was a big debate, and the EU then slowed down discussions with Switzerland on an integration in the internal energy market, which was just something completely separate, but they created a direct link, and that was political. So the EU can use disagreements in certain areas to slow down progress in other areas as a way of putting pressure on the other side to budge.
And coming back to the negotiations that the UK is having with the EU now, on issues such as data and financial services, where it's not a negotiation between the UK and the EU, in that both parties and the EU in particular have said, well, we'll deal with these issues unilaterally. We'll decide whether to grant you equivalence for financial services or adequacy for data by ourselves. We won't negotiate it, we'll just decide. Technically speaking, that should be completely unrelated to the trade agreement discussions. There should be no overlap, because you could decide that irrespective of what happens with the free trade agreement, technically speaking. Politically, of course they're going to be linked. If we have a trade agreement at the end of the year between the EU and the UK, I fully expect that the UK will also have a data adequacy ruling in its favour, and also there'll be equivalence for financial services. If we don't have a trade agreement at the end of the year, no technical reason why we couldn't have the other two, but politically...
But no chance.
Politically it just seems quite unlikely, or it would be limited, or they'll put in place, say, time limits and the like to try and keep pressure on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those unilateral measures will be dependent on what comes out of these negotiations right now. I suspect that the EU would be more willing for these unilateral measures to last longer, for example, and to have less conditionality attached if they have reached some form of an agreement to cover goods, customs, tariffs, governance and fish.
Fish,
back
yes.
to the meat of the issue.
Or the fish, yes.
How much do you think really changes in terms of who's fishing for what in our waters, putting the rhetoric of the British government position to one side? for now, if we look ahead to if there is a successful agreement? What do you think, Georgina?
So I think fish is a really contentious issue, and actually the language that is in this mandate compared to the draft mandate that was published at the beginning of the month is a lot tougher.
That's the Europe one you're
the EU's mandate. Yes,
the
EU's mandate.
Listeners.
The EU's mandate, the language on fish is a lot tougher, and that's because some member states are really worried, and they're thinking, well, if we are going to compromise at some point, we should start at a point where it's absolutely upholding the existing arrangement, we will accept nothing else, potentially knowing that actually it will be a compromise further down the line. But it is something that France is worried about, and I think the EU Minister, Amélie de Montchalin, has been on record saying that this was an absolute deal breaker. But there are other member states as well.
And it has to be done by the 1st of July.
Well,
or so it hints and suggests.
Yeah, I think this is something that the EU will want some clarity on and movement on earlier in the negotiations. Absolutely, and they will, and this is something I think they're probably going to start talking about it in a couple of weeks. But is that deadline set in stone? I don't know. I think it's not like extending Article 50 negotiations or extending the transition period where that deadline is set in stone, has to be made in the summer. We'll see, but I suspect that this is the other important thing. It's not just France that cares about this fisheries agreement. There are other member states as well, but they're lining up quite conveniently behind France and letting France take the stand.
Are the services sector slightly forgotten in the various sectors of the service industry? Are they pretty much forgotten in this? Or?
They're not forgotten, but they are treated as if we are talking about a free trade agreement, which is what we are. And to elaborate on what I mean by that, what you can do on services in a free trade agreement is nothing like the status quo. So EU membership on services, the single market in services, very much exists, and it allows you to do things that you can't do if you don't have a trade agreement, or even if you do have a trade agreement. And that's how it's approached. So the future free trade agreement that's being proposed will cover services, it just won't offer much more than the status quo. There's some interesting quirks in the two different mandates, in that the UK and EU are largely aligned on this in terms of what they're talking about. They know the format, they know what a free trade agreement does and what it doesn't. But the EU have said they want to exclude audiovisual services from the discussion, which they always do in their trade agreements because of the French. The UK have said they want to include it. So that's one area where even on the trade side there is some tiny disagreement, and the UK will just have to budge on that. The EU aren't moving.
And the difference between the EU draft mandate and the one that was finally adopted, they did add a paragraph on financial services and equivalence decisions, making it very clear that these would be unilateral measures and mechanisms, so it would be the EU granting these to the UK. But it does say that there would need to be consultation with the UK.
Well, and this is it. So there, people, when they talk about this trade agreement, they're saying it doesn't cover services. It will cover services. It will have long pages and pages of schedules covering services, saying what you can do and what you can't do in a very narrow way. Doesn't do much, will do next to nothing on the regulatory side, which is where the barriers are. But there will, for example, be a financial services chapter. Most likely. What will it do? It will commit both the UK and the EU to create a dialogue between their regulators so as to iron out issues in the future. Useful, but nothing like passporting or what exists now.
The people who are actually negotiating on our side, on their side, the SNP were particularly rude about our calibre and our performance in the House of Commons today. How do the two sides measure up in terms of experience, acumen?
I mean, I don't work for the government or for the EU. What I would say is that the EU are formidable trade negotiators. This is what they do really well. They have a process that reflects years of fine-tuning. They have picked the people who had been working on Brexit issues in different departments. They've brought them in. They feel like they have the right people with the right experience and the right level of knowledge. So not only about sort of what happens under EU law, but also a good firm understanding of common law, of WTO law, and also the politics of negotiations. I think on the EU side, they will be including many more people as well. So we know that on the security side, they will be involving their colleagues from the European External Action Service, which is this de facto EU foreign ministry industry, they'll be leading on that. There'll also be close collaboration with the Department for Trade, and we know that the head of the Department for Trade used to be the deputy chief negotiator during the Article 50 negotiations. So there's a lot of linkages there. I think on the UK side, we think roughly 40 to 50 people, I think, on their task force. One thing that I was really struck by is actually when I was in Washington back in April, I met someone there who had recently left the US administration and said, I've met some of your trade negotiators. So these are not the people who will be looking at the UK-EU negotiation, but people who were looking at the UK-US trade negotiation. They were saying they're very good on detail. We're just not sure they have the experience of negotiating. And so they said, we threw a curveball, we tried to see how they react, and they didn't know how to react. But that was back in April, and I think the civil service has shown that it can be incredibly agile. So who knows? But
the point I would make here when it comes to these negotiations is the people we have doing it are fine. Because the issues aren't about technical things around, well, how big should this quota be? What should, there's some issues on rules of origin which we'll have to deal with, but largely, what are the big disagreements here? They're political. So they're on fish. Do we allow access to our fishing waters or not, and under which terms? If the Prime Minister tells them, well, I want you to find a solution on this, and this is the broad range of what I want, this is broadly what I want you to do, they can pull something together. We saw it with Northern Ireland and the Northern Ireland Protocol last year. On, say, Court of Justice, on environment and state aid, these are political decisions. And so I have the full confidence that if the ministerial direction is there and they're told to find a solution within certain parameters, that they can do so. It's not quite the same as, say, negotiating with the US when we're not going for zero tariff quota free. We're going to have to go tariff line by tariff line, and it's a bit different. I feel this negotiation is just driven by the politics. So I think focusing on the actual civil servants who are tasked with delivering it is kind of missing the point.
Yeah, and I think the key for those civil servants is what you've said, is knowing how far they can go. Having a clear understanding of the priorities, the red lines, and that place for fudging and compromise.
And maybe being a smaller, leaner team without much reference to Parliament, one of these mandates in front of you came from the Cabinet, or one section of the Cabinet, or maybe even smaller than that, and the other one went around 27 countries. Yeah. Does that give an advantage? Maybe.
Possibly.
You can be lighter on your feet.
Possibly, and when you tour EU capitals, they say to some degree there's a little bit of relief that actually the government has a majority in Parliament, because at least that process looks like it will be simpler this time round. But on the EU side, it could be much more complicated, and that's because the Commission and the EU governments have a process, which I said is very rigid. They have constant feedback before and after every negotiating round. For contentious issues, they will, if member states feel the Commission is taking a too hardline position, they will push back on that. And likewise, if they think the Commission's being soft, they'll push back on that as well. But it's also about the European Parliament. The European Parliament has to sign this deal off, much more fractured this time round, many more MEPs who want to be seen to be standing up for their constituencies. And then depending on the kind of agreement, whether it covers areas of law that fall under member state law, not just EU law, so that's things like transport, for example. There are EU countries that legislate in certain areas, and then the EU will legislate as a whole in other areas. If that agreement covers areas of law that fall under the EU and member states, then it possibly will need to be signed off by national and regional parliaments. Now, there is a way of provisionally applying the agreement, but it does mean many more EU voices added to the mix. So for the EU, that balance, it could be problematic in that it would make it less agile and less able to respond quickly, but also it could be a point of leverage where it says, look, really sorry, our position reflects hours and hours of negotiations, we can't really move much.
On the UK side, so I think that was a very, very good overview, but on the UK side, do I think that if the Prime Minister signs off an agreement with the EU that he can sell it at home? Yes. He has an 80-seat majority. If he says he's happy with it, even if a few people are a bit annoyed, it's fine. So, and I think that does help on this front, in that, from the EU's perspective, under Theresa May, it was a nightmare. Mm.
She could say something and it didn't
matter.
Last a minute.
But now if you do get the Prime Minister on board, that it will probably happen. We saw that with the withdrawal agreement last year.
Just finally, the US trade representative is suspiciously over here. You can't help thinking that on the same day that these talks start on Monday with the European Union, there's going to be a photo op somewhere and the talks will simultaneously start with the United States. Will that have any impact? Some Brexiteers particularly were hoping that it might just put some pressure on the EU. Will it have any impact?
I've had to revise my opinion slightly on UK-US in that I'd assumed that following the UK leaving the European Union that we'd make a big song and dance about the US, about it being a number one priority, and for the reasons you said there, some Brexiters think it gives us leverage over the EU, which is debatable, but at least an argument you can engage with, and then also because for many of them it's what they've wanted to do all along. But then if you actually look at what the government's doing, it gives you cause for thought. You think, when you look at Huawei, and if you strip out all of the talk about national security and the like, the government's prioritised rolling out 5G quickly in the UK over the immediate relationship with the United States. Boris Johnson's postponed his trip to Washington. The US negotiating mandate, the negotiating mandate for the UK's agreement with the US or objectives is meant to be published next week, but that was, by all accounts, could have probably been published before the general election. It's been sitting there for a while. So I actually think the UK is being much more cautious with regards to the US than I expected. And that doesn't mean I don't think there'll be a photo shot with Lighthizer when he's over here, and that won't be put in contrast with the EU and saying, look, we're negotiating with both. But a bit more measured than I was expecting.
And I think there's recognition that this is also going to be a tough negotiation, right? The US and the UK probably want different things. There'll be some things they agree on, but there'll be lots of other things that they don't agree on. It won't be a straightforward negotiation. You can reach some form of like commercial agreement, for example, but if you're looking at a fully fledged free trade agreement, that's an entirely different ballgame. And also I think the politics you mentioned, some of the decisions that the UK government has taken recently, which were at odds perhaps with the positions by the US administration, but also the US is about to enter a presidential election. Is this really the time? And if you are looking at a fully fledged free trade agreement, that would need to pass through Congress. Is it likely that Congress would pass it in the midst of a presidential election?
They're not giving Donald Trump another trade agreement. They gave him one recently because he renegotiated NAFTA and Congress signed them off. They're not going to give him a fully fledged free trade agreement with the UK this year. What I think we could see, though, is some, as Georgina referenced, some sort of smaller agreement. So something for Trump to say, look, I did something with the UK, something for, we can envision the BBC or Channel 4 headline now, UK and US do trade agreement. It doesn't really matter if it's just a piece of paper saying, well, we'd like to do this in future. That's how it'll play out, and that's how it'll be received by the public. So I could see that happening this year, but a fully fledged free trade agreement would be very difficult to do this year, even if we really, really wanted it. And I'm actually looking at the British government and saying it doesn't seem to be your number one priority. You both watch trade, have watched it for years, and now it having been an EU competence, your home team is playing. Are you excited? Well, it's quite fun. From just a professional perspective, it means that we're both very, very busy. So that's interesting. I think it's going to be quite exciting to see what the UK's approach to trade more generally looks like over the coming years. We're sort of rewriting a trade strategy from scratch. And my hope is that we do that in a sensible way, in a considered way, and we don't just run headfirst into whatever is into agreement with the US or whoever else without properly thinking about it. And some of the action from government recently has actually reassured me on that point.
I also think that trade has been it's been a bubble for way too long, and actually it's quite a good thing that people are taking an interest in it. The problem is that it's very complicated. Negotiations don't always end up where we think they will be, and actually there's a lot of technical detail in there. So it's great for us because it's the politics meets the technical, and then just following a negotiation really closely. The question is, how do you communicate that in a simple way that does not cut corners? But I think overall it's probably a very good thing. Although
I'd add one caveat there, which is sort of the guilty secret of people who work on trade, is that normal trade agreements aren't actually that important for the economy. So if we're talking about something really comprehensive and ingrained like the EU, obviously we've been in for 40 years, obviously leaving it has a cost. And obviously if you do a trade agreement with the US, it will have some benefits, but actually it's quite small. If you're looking at numbers, sort of UK-US agreement is estimated to improve GDP relative to some future counterfactual by about 0.3, 0.4%. It's not very big. You know, so when I look at the government and see, oh, you're prioritising the rollout of 5G over that, I sort of go, well, it kind of makes sense. But of course, we don't like to shout about this too loudly, because otherwise no one would invite us to speak to you. You wouldn't invite us to speak to you on your podcast.
And it's not just about trade. There are there's security, foreign policy, cooperation, and what the UK decides to do domestically, which is different as well. So I think, yeah, it's an exciting year.
Thank you both for helping us through it, and I'm sure we'll have you back if you'll come.
Of course.
Thank you so much for talking to us. Cheers.
Thank you.